doncs, si podem començar el cicle de seminaris, en aquest cas un cicle de seminaris que és coorganitzat entre la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència i l'Institut Interuniversitari López Piñero. En aquest cas, faré una breu introducció del cicle i després donarem pas a Tatiana Kasperski per a començar la sessió. En aquest primer semestre hem organitzat un cicle que es titula Energia, Past and Present, que justament ens permetrà reflexionar sobre la situació del conflicte energètic en l'actualitat amb una perspectiva històrica. Com des de fa molts anys, la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència organitza cicles de col·loquis i també en molts casos són organitzats en col·laboració amb altres institucions del nostre àmbit, en aquest cas la Universitat de València i l'Institut Històric López Piñero. L'any passat vam tindre tres cicles de col·loquis. El primer va ser organitzat per la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, l'Institut d'Història, un cicle dedicat a la tecnologia i el capitalisme. En segon lloc, es va fer un cicle sobre el 30 aniversari per a celebrar el 30 aniversari de la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència i també es va fer un cicle de col·loquis a Vic. Respecte al primer cicle, el de Tecnologia en Capitalisme que he esmentat abans, s'han fet diverses activitats de difusió posteriorment a aquest cicle que volia aprofitar per a enfatitzar i mostrar la seva vàlua. També recordar que quasi totes les activitats, els seminaris, els col·loquis organitzats per la societat es poden trobar en la secció de biblioteca. Ahí teniu l'adreça corresponent. I en aquest cas podeu trobar també una sèrie d'entrevistes que varen fer-se als ponents i a les ponents del cicle organitzat l'any passat. No volia deixar d'aprofitar per a presentar-lo. En aquest cas, com en aquest nou curs, el 2022-2023, la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència ha organitzat diferents seminaris. Un d'ells serà aquest nou cicle que estem presentant avui, el d'Energia, Past and Present, que es farà entre setembre i desembre. Comptarem amb quatre persones, quatre expertes en aquest àmbit. Avui començarem amb Tatiana Kasperski, també tindrem a Cara Dallet en octubre, a Anael Marrec en novembre i a Roberto Cantoni en desembre. I després, en gener-juny, tindrem un seminari que serà a càrrec de Hans-Henrik Hitchmitzhelf i un cicle de col·loquis que també es farà a Vic. Per últim, voldria presentar a la ponent d'avui, Tatiana Kasperski, que és especialista en energia nuclear en l'antiga Unió Soviètica i treballa en diversos projectes relacionats amb la comprensió pública de la ciència i, en particular, l'energia nuclear. Va aconseguir una beca Marie Curie a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, on treballa actualment com a investigadora. És membre de diferents grups de recerca, com ara Honest, History of Nuclear Energy and Society, i Kasperski també participa en el projecte de recerca Nuclear Legacies, negociació de la radioactivitat a Rússia, França i Suècia, al Centre d'Estudis del Bàltic i de la Unió Europea Oriental, que està en la Södertörn University, en Suècia. Kasperski va obtindre el seu doctorat en Ciències Po, en París, on va escriure una tesi sobre la política de memòria del desastre a Chernobyl, en el cas de Bielorússia. Després va ser investigadora postdoctoral al Centre Alexandre Coiré d'Història de la Ciència i la Tecnologia a París i va continuar estudiant l'energia nuclear i la governança del risc tecnològic a la Rússia postsoviètica i a Ucrània. En el seu llibre, Les polítiques de la radioactivitat, que podeu trobar allà a la dreta de la imatge, tracta sobre moltes de les qüestions que s'analitzaran en el nostre cicle de seminaris. Analitza el cas de Bielorússia, una antiga república soviètica, i els seus esforços per a posar en funcionament la primera central nuclear de la seva història. El país encara patia les conseqüències mediambientals i sanitàries del desastre de Txernòbil de 1986. El llibre analitza com va poder Bielorússia oblidar Txernòbil i deixar-se seduir per l'àtom civil. Com va ser possible aquesta amnèsia? Es pregunta. En el seminari d'aquesta vesprada, Tatiana Kasperski ens parlarà sobre la imatge pública de l'energia nuclear i de la paradoxa entre el debat sobre si es tracta d'una energia verda i les crítiques per l'impacte dels seus residus tòxics. De segur que la seva panoràmica històrica i les seues reflexions ens ajudaran a repensar aquesta paradoxa i el paper de l'energia nuclear en l'actualitat, marcada per invasions de països veïns, lobbies energètics, captura d'experts i interessos geoestratègics i econòmics. Moltes gràcies, Tatiana.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for this wonderful presentation. The work I will be presented today, we need to switch.
Yes, just a second. And then...
So the work I will be presenting today is part of my research in the project on global nuclear environment that I do with Professor Paul Josephson. And it's a cooperation between Colby College, USA, and Pompeu Fabra University. So while Ignacio is arranging the screens, I can start with a disclaimer. As often with work in progress, I was overly optimistic in what I promised in the description of this talk. So there will be questions that I will have to leave to the discussion. So I don't know if you followed very recent controversies and debates over whether to include nuclear energy into the green list of green investments of the European Union. Finally, it was included in July of this year. And those countries who opposed it, and most of all Germany, really worried that we cannot consider nuclear energy as green investment because of the radioactive waste. But ultimately, many of us historians or social scientists who work on nuclear energy were puzzled at how much this issue of radioactive waste is still not very publicly visible. At least it's not enough to convince the public that to doubt about the clean and green character of the nuclear energy. And maybe it also happens because nuclear energy, as some other technologies, are often evaluated based on its future promises as opposed to its past accomplishments. And these are promises of clean, green, maybe not so cheap, but still safe energy that would help us to cope with climate change. And we as scholars and scientists, I think, really need to look at the past and present of this energy. And this is what this seminar series are dedicated to, in order to judge for ourselves if these promises are really convincing. And there will be several ways which I would like to, several dimensions I would like to emphasize in the history of radioactive waste management and the public visibility of these issues. First of all, that I would like to really consider both military and civilian radioactive waste, because I think they're really very much connected. But the whole nuclear order is now based on their artificial separation. But as we see with Russia invasion of Ukraine, occupation of nuclear power plant, even civilian nuclear installations can be instruments of war. And historically, these are two sides of the same problem. And other dimension to which I will try to pay attention is the public visibility and how it evolved during the history of the nuclear age. So just a few, but here can we sort of make this disappear a bit?
Close no, down, silenciar, your image.
Okay. Well, if you could help me while I'm trying to explain. So this is most of the radioactive waste comes from nuclear weapons production and nuclear energy production. And if you look at the nuclear fuel cycle, they're really quite similar. And each stage of this cycles produce important amount of waste, with most of waste being produced in the nuclear reactor and from spent nuclear fuel reprocessing. So these are the technologies that basically use the same materials, uranium, the same technologies such as reprocessing and enrichments, and they really rely on the same knowledge infrastructures. Okay. How does one change? Here, okay. And just very briefly, main categories of waste from very low level to high level waste. And what is important to know is the high level waste, which contains products of fission, constitutes 95% of radioactivity and only 3% of volume. And as we will later see, this is the waste on which public attention is mostly focused, whereas the low and very low intermediate level represent important volumes, especially low level waste, but less of radioactivity, and maybe this is the reason why they sort of attract less of the public attention, although they still can be a very important problem for health and environment. So historically, of course, production of radioactive waste started when humans first tried to harness radioactivity, but this problem grew significantly in scope when several of the countries, first USSR, US and Britain, and then France and China, started to develop a large infrastructure for research and development of the nuclear weapons. And that's when the first period I distinguish in the history of radioactive waste management started, the period of technical experimentation. And of all the massive research and development facilities, the sites were dedicated to plutonium production produced the most toxic waste. And in the case of US weapons project, Manhattan project, that was the case of the Hanford site. Initially, the strategies of dealing with the radioactive waste were quite primitive, and they were sort of invented on the spot and never were part of the initial design of the facilities. And as IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency recommendation of the 61 put it, there are two basic strategies: disperse and dilute, versus concentrate and contain. So dispersing and diluting referred to the waste that was liquid, usually low level or intermediate level waste, which was put directly into the water bodies in the environment, sometimes through filtering, sometimes not. The concentrate and contain referred to the high-level liquid waste that was usually stored in tanks in the hope that it will somewhat decay and then evaporate and become more solid and would be easier to handle it. So there were this huge tanks in the Hanford facilities, almost hundreds of them. And first they were single-shelled and they eventually started leaking. And then they were replaced by the double-shell tanks. Soviet Union was even more reckless in dealing with liquid waste from this plutonium production, because they were pouring high-level radioactive waste and directly into the environment, and the Kiziltash Lake, and then in the Techa River, where the Mayak facility in the Urals was situated. After 8 years of pouring this waste, they realized that the inhabitants of several of the villages downstream were severely exposed and they had to be relocated. So they started to store the waste in tanks, and these tanks were poorly taken care of, which led to the explosion known as Kishtim disaster that contaminated more than 20,000 square kilometers of the territory. And then they continued to pour waste into sort of more engineered ponds during the whole Soviet period. So as for the solid waste, which was usually low-level waste, it was also often put in all the countries directly in the ground, usually in the vicinity of the research laboratory and plutonium production facilities in the canyons, simple trenches, and so on. But the scientists, were understanding that they were sort of experimenting and that this was not the ideal solution for the radioactive waste in the long run. And as early as 48, we have this report by the Atomic Energy Commission in the US saying, we'll eventually run into trouble. So there were a lot of creative solutions proposed, like sending the waste to the moon, or pouring it to the volcans, or even creating a radiological weapon with it. But ultimately, the solution that many countries preferred is to dispose of the waste into the ocean. And although USSR was the first country that started it in 1946, it was more European countries that started to rely on this practice, such as, first of all, Great Britain, and later France. And then also Japan, so the countries that didn't have those large territories to dump the radioactive waste there. And Great Britain was the first country that actually created a pipe from its facility in Sellafield that basically disposed the radioactive liquid waste directly into the Irish Sea. And so in the 60s, and starting from late 50s and 60s, there started to be discussion in different international settings about that this practice is really bad and polluting the ocean. And one of the most vocal opponents of this practice was the Soviet Union, but was really found some allies in some scientific circles to really protest this practice by USSR and Great Britain. And but secretly, of course, Soviet Union was the country that disposed most of the waste in this way and continued this practice for the longest period. And here there's this very marvelous book by Jacob Hamblin on this issue. I really like to have physical books because I feel like I have the power and the weight of knowledge with me. Great Britain in the early 60s, US ultimately discontinued this practice, and but Great Britain continued and even mobilized other European countries to create sort of common mechanism to coordinate their dumpings. And this coordinated dumpings was done by 8 countries in the 70s and the 60s and 70s through Nuclear Energy Agency, which was part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But at the same time as the ocean dumping was being developed and criticized, first American scientists started, and then scientists in other countries started to get interested into them in the geological disposal. And Atomic Energy Commission asked American National Academy of Science to study the possibilities. And in '57, the Academy produced a rather known report on the disposal of radioactive waste on land. And this report recommended deep geological disposal for the first time. Now it's sort of the solution to the waste, and that was first recommended in '57. And the scientists said that salt rock is probably the most promising hosting rock to isolate radioactive waste. So US started a research project, Salt World project in Kansas in late '60s, and other countries followed. For instance, Germany identified the former salt mine in Asse site, and it used it as a disposal site for its waste from late '60s and through the '70s. So in Spain, first radioactive waste was dumped directly into former uranium mine at El Cabril, and eventually a few decades later, a proper disposal site was built there. So during this first period in the '40s and '50s and '60s, the radioactive waste was seen as merely a technical problem. And this problem was mostly discussed by the specialists who were absolutely confident that a solution will be found. And meanwhile, they were experimenting with different solutions without feeling any urgency to solve this problem, because they think, the civilian nuclear applications were still in their early development, so they felt that the amounts of waste are still not that important. And the public awareness of this problem was very limited at this period, but it will soon start to change. And from the '70s and through the '80s, starts this period that I call the public period and the radioactive waste management, because radioactive waste really becomes a public affair, public issues. And that's probably connected to several things. First of all, to the massive developments of civilian nuclear energy programs that could not be managed with the same secrecy, and which also produced large amounts of highly radioactive waste. Just to give a few numbers, if in 1960 there were only 17 power reactors in France, USSR, and US. By 1980, there were 253 operating reactors in 22 countries, plus a lot of research reactors or reactors for propulsion for submarines and ships and so on and so forth. It's also as a period of the development of environmental movement and anti-nuclear movement became quite powerful in several Western European countries and in the US during this period. And although in many countries people mostly protested against nuclear power plants, and in several contexts, radioactive waste also became a very serious issue. And the way that the radioactive waste problem became a public affair is through this conflict around the siting of the radioactive waste disposals. But mostly the problem was the sightings of the high-level waste disposal. It means spent nuclear fuel or products of reprocessing of the spent nuclear fuel, because lower and intermediate level waste facilities were created without any public opposition, with exception of South Korea, where there were really almost riots against the first waste facility. And for example, in Sweden in the 70s, there was a very powerful anti-nuclear movement on the national level, but when nuclear authorities started to do first test drilling in several municipalities in Sweden to find the best geology for the deep geological repository, initially there were no public opposition in late 70s, but in early 80s we see really important local protests against this facility. So this process had to be stopped. And the same in France, where in late 80s newly created National Agency for Radioactive Waste Management started drilling holes in several municipalities in France in 87, thinking that it's just a technical problem and can be solved without consultation with the public, and that led to powerful public protests, and eventually a moratorium for such research was decided for 15 years. In Germany, the opposition to the nuclear waste repository was centered around Gorleben, and the position was very powerful, both locally, starting from mid-70s, and also nationally. Another very important feature of this period, and the sign that the states and the industry started to really pay attention to this problem and invest some funds, is the beginning of institutionalization of radioactive waste management and creation of different either public agencies or private companies to manage radioactive waste. And the process started in the early 70s, but the timeline was very different from different countries. Finally, a very important new period in radioactive waste management starts with the end of Cold War, and actually a bit earlier with the disarmament, because all this decommissioned nuclear arms also presented a radioactive waste. So with the end of Cold War, liberalization of the USSR and its collapse, it started to become to stop weapons production and start looking into all the pollution and waste it produced. And European enlargement also played an important role in the evolution of international regulation and European regulation in the area of radioactive waste management. So maybe one of the most significant international relation of this area is the relation of Soviet radioactive waste dumps in the Arctic, because in I think 92 someone filmed a Soviet ship trying to get rid of the radioactive waste in the Pacific, and that produced an important international outcry, because it was contrary to the London the so-called London Convention against the maritime pollution that was first adopted in 72. And through this convention, it was prohibited to dispose of the highly radioactive waste. But later, there were some modifications, and ultimately in 93, the prohibition of disposing any waste in the sea was finally adopted. But it was revealed that the international community put a lot of pressure on the newly independent and democratizing Russia, and they finally had to produce some reports on the scale of the problem in the Arctic. even if initial report published in '93 didn't reveal all the radioactive waste dump. So there are really, tens of thousands of radioactive waste containers, a lot of them high-level waste, entire nuclear reactors with spent nuclear fuel, entire nuclear submarines, and other waste, including the waste from nuclear navy and from research and medical institutions. So this revelation also led to rather intense international cooperation in the Arctic. And here are some of the project and also some rather important cleanup started in this area with international funding, for instance, through initiative established through J8 group. United States also started very ambitious plan of cleanup through its Office of Environmental Management in 1989. And it's important to mention something that actually occurred in the 70s. It's this separation of military and civilian waste, and the Atomic Energy Commission was divided into NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was charged to handle civilian uses of nuclear energy, and Department of Energy, was actually responsible for the military side. And the Department of Energy established in early 90s that to clean all its the so-called nuclear legacy, it will take 75 years and up to $400 billion. But of course, the cost continued to rise. And today, one estimates that only the Hanford side would cost up to 700 billions to clean up. And it's indeed the legacy of plutonium production heritage in Hanford is really quite massive, with those famous tank farms and hundreds of square kilometers of contaminated groundwater and so on and so forth. Quite interesting development also happened in the level of Europe and European enlargement, because many of the countries of the former Soviet bloc wanted to join European community, and they brought into European integration also all this nuclear legacy and radioactive waste from the Cold War era. This nuclear legacy included around 30 nuclear reactors, some of them decommissioned, and most of them of the Soviet design, and radioactive waste from these reactors and defense and research and medical programs. And what European countries realized is that there is no actually legislation at the European Union, because before that countries considered that there is enough of international regulations, and there was like this slow harmonization of national legislation. But with this new coming of the new members from Central and Eastern Europe, there is this need of developing sort of common legislation that new and old members would enforce. And we see this adoption first of nuclear package that contained some proposals of nuclear regulation, and most importantly this 2011 European Council directive on radioactive waste management, which prescribed to the state to sort of develop the long-term strategies and, if possible, start to develop deep geological repositories. And finally, there was rather important progress on the siting of deep geological repositories or underground laboratories for high-level waste in several countries that had to abandon these initiatives in the 80s. What happened is that it started to be based on more voluntary participation of municipalities and with public participation and public hearings on each side. So Sweden selected in 2009 the Forsmark site, which already hosted nuclear power plant. And earlier this year, finally, Swedish government approved the building of the final repository. But the country which will be the first in the world to actually build the repository is Finland, that started the process in the early 2000s and now is very close to commissioning its the first deep geological repository for high-level waste. So this is a very, very brief overview of the history of radioactive waste management and what sort of insights can we draw from the history. So we see that how this radioactive waste project from very technical issue, which was to be discussed in a very limited technical, scientific and military circles, became in the 70s and 80s a really public affair with strong public opposition, but which also led to some understanding that radioactive waste management is not just technical, but also political, social, and cultural issue. And an important input from the public is unnecessary. And one would say, of course, that the safety of the nuclear waste management improved and the public visibility of this issue improved. And yet still we sort of see that there are certain types of waste that still receive very, very little attention. And just trying to understand why there is this limited visibility on this issue. I looked, for instance, into the changing and clashing definition of what's radioactive and what is waste, because one would think that is something already well established and referring to some understandable to everyone set of materials, but actually the definitions of what is radioactive and what is waste vary greatly depending on the context and also political, economic, and cultural considerations. For instance, radioactive doesn't refer just to any materials that contain radioactivity and for which there is no expected use, but this radioactivity depends on the highly controversial thresholds and scenarios of public exposure, because like with other toxical substances, as very well shown in this book, we talk about acceptable level of exposure, not just zero exposure. And as many national and international nuclear institutions remind us, radioactivity is a natural phenomenon, so we cannot avoid to be exposed to it. We just sort of have to establish safe thresholds of exposure. And what is safe, what is not, is of course highly varied through history and varies depends on political and economic factors. And it's also extremely complex matter to determine these thresholds, because the way we're affected by radioactivity depends on the concrete materials we deal with, the protection measure we can employ, and the ways of exposure, the time of exposure, and many other factors. That means this, it's very hard to, the solid science, which is supposed to be a base of these thresholds, is not just science, but is determined by other factors. And here there is a very wonderful chapter on written by Clara Florenzo on Palomares accident, and you can see those early negotiations about what is safe exposure and what should be waste and what should be cleaned up and what should remain. And of course, the power relationship are not equal. So it's a very good historic example of this threshold controversies. But what is waste is also not as clear and varies in different contexts. And maybe the most known example is the one of spent nuclear fuel, which is in several countries. Accidentally, most of these countries have nuclear weapons, is considered a resource because most of the uranium contained in the spent nuclear fuel, in the nuclear fuel remains in spent nuclear fuel up to 94%, and also there is plutonium that is contained in nuclear fuel. And basically, what is called nuclear recycling, which sounds like this green and responsible technology, is the technology which was used to extract plutonium for the bomb. It's not green because it's produced other types of rather toxic waste, but it's also a problem for proliferation, and it's extremely costly. And another sort of type of waste, which is rarely treated as waste, but actually is a really significant problem for environment and public health, is uranium mining and milling. Uranium mining mill, they produce really a huge amount of waste and volume, and these are the waste that are basically, in most of the cases, were just abandoned on the spot without proper containment, contaminated environment and groundwater. Just to give you an idea of the scope of the problem, here is some picture of the quantity of abandoned uranium mines only in the US, which is no longer really producing uranium. It's tens of thousands of such abandoned mines. And of course, most of these mines are situated on the territories of the indigenous people. I found a number of 70% of uranium mines, past and present, are situated on the territories of where indigenous people live. So it's extractive and destructive colonialism in action. Here, the map of 500 abandoned uranium mines in the US, which are situated on the territory of Navajo Nation. And these mines are not monitored and cleaned up by Department of Energy, which is supposed to be responsible for Cold War waste by the Environmental Protection Agency. And in most of the national context, not most, but in many of them, the waste from mining and milling of uranium is not considered as radioactive waste. So you don't find this waste in the radioactive waste inventories. Another waste, which is also not usually considered as a radioactive waste and a regulation, but which is radioactive waste, is the waste from nuclear test sites. And there have been, of course, thousands of these nuclear tests worldwide. Also, a lot of them on the territories where indigenous people live. And only recently there started to be some reckoning with this legacy and with the waste, radioactive waste it corresponds to. Maybe the most visible material the most known material monument to this waste is the one of the dome, a concrete dome on a ruined site in Marshall Islands, where United States tested atomic weapons, and the whole atoll was cleaned up, and dirty soil, contaminated soil, was dumped in the bomb crater and covered with concrete dome. But of course, now it's considered no longer very efficient in isolating the radioactivity from the environment, especially connected to the in connection with global warming. And finally, the waste, which is so rarely treated as waste, is the waste from nuclear accidents, and it's especially true in the case of Chernobyl, because major nuclear accidents, of course, produced vast wastelands where everything is technically radioactive waste: the soil, the vegetation, the buildings, even the animals. But it's not really treated as waste until someone starts managing it. So, you know, from Fukushima case, we do have this pictures of millions of bags with contaminated soil. So we really see the consequences of the accident as radioactive waste. In the case of Chernobyl, you may have followed all those controversies and long and painful process of building a new confinement structure, this huge arch of the destroyed reactors that cost more than $1 billion in euros and took decades of international cooperation. And you know, one should remember that it's not even a disposal site. It's just some protection structure that can protect environment while the process of actually dismantling what is inside and, you know, packaging and disposing it as radioactive waste can be done, and this process hasn't even started. So this is some of my reflections about the history of radioactive waste management as public controversy and the public visibility of this issue. And I often think of the public visibility of radioactive waste problem in these terms that International Atomic Energy Agency used in these early recommendations of diluting and dispersing versus concentrating and containing. And for me, it looks like the attention, the public attention, is either dispersed and diluted and sort of cannot really focus on so many aspects of vast amounts of radioactive waste, but at the same time it's sort of focused and contained on this problem of high-level waste disposal in deep geological repository, which is a serious problem, but it's just such a small part of the whole amount of issues that are caused by radioactive waste. So whatever I forgot to mention.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for your excellent talk. So now I think we have enough time for open a discussion, which is also open for the 24 people who following online. So I will check the chat too, but please feel free to ask questions, comments.
Things I promised in the abstract but failed to address.
Yes, please, José Ramón Bertomeu.
Thank you very much for this talk. It's This is a very good beginning of the seminar series on energy and present. And well, I have different questions, but just to begin with, let's keep this discussion comparison between radioactivity and other toxic products, because usually they say that radioactivity doesn't work in the same way as the other toxic products from the point of view of the historical actors, from the point of view of sources, secrecy, is connected to the governmental and the military complex, which is behind radioactivity, doesn't apply for other toxic, for most of them at least, and regulation. The kind of regulation we have in radioactivity are different from the regulation in other topics. At least the international regulation concerning radioactivity seems to have been reached before other regulation concerning other kinds of topics. So I would like you to develop a little bit more this question, this comparison, because you mentioned, of course, the question of thresholds, the question of safe levels. Of course, this is also a political and economic, and at the same time, it's a scientific, technological, complex issue in other toxic products. But let's follow this discussion you mentioned on regulation, on international regulation. In good sense, international regulation on radioactivity waste is different or not connected with other international regulation concerning other toxic products, let's say pesticides, for instance.
I already, needed a lot of courage to jump into this international view of radioactive waste. And another very courageous thing I did lately is to stop limiting myself on civilian nuclear application. So this is definitely the direction I would like to go, but I still don't have enough knowledge and strength and courage. So I was counting sort of on you making comments, so to sort of push me there. But in general, it is, of course, the world nuclear order, it is based on nuclear exceptionality. And the nuclear non-proliferation regime around nuclear weapons is a really important organizational elements, and this nuclear order, which is extremely unfair and extremely unstable, as we can see now, really relies on this division of that there will be like those few who will have the right to have nuclear weapons, and that the others will be compensated by the fact that they can benefit from the civilian nuclear applications. And and this order is based on this distinction between civilian and military application, which is, of course, very artificial, because there is all this complex system of surveillance of civilian nuclear applications, because they can also be some military use that can develop. And this is, this very complex system is something I think which is maybe differentiates nuclear regulations from regulations of other toxins on the international level. But I think are sort of a more day-to-day level, local, national. I think there is much more comparison to be drawn. And I still think that the literature on the radioactivity and nuclear history maybe is a bit more developed than the literature on other toxics. Maybe I'm, somewhat ignorant, but when I sort of wanted to look into this more closely, there's not that many books on the subject. So, and because we don't know that much about it, so we also tend to think that it's different, that if it develops more, we'll, because it's definitely, one of the things I would like to do is also to challenge this exceptionality of the nuclear energy and nuclear technology, which is also politically constructed and is part of this nuclear order. So it's a very important direction of future research.
I have a question in relation to the approach or the position that historians should have, in your opinion, on this topic. Because in your presentation you have shown the book by Jacob Hamlin and then the one of the research project of Cicle. And I think that maybe there's some difference there. I'm not sure. In Bristol, we were talking in the meeting by the European Society of the European Society on Environmental History. There was like one session where Jacob Hamlin was participating, and he at one point of the discussion, it was an open discussion, he, if I understood correctly, emphasized the point that historians should not have should do a more kind of objective approach to this issue, and that this idea of the situated knowledge, that has been around for decades, was not so important, and it was very important not to position it. And in the other hand, the book Toxicos Invisibles is well situated. There's no doubt in that sense. I don't know what is your opinion in this sense, or if you understand working or coming in another way, because that was its position in that meeting. I don't know if your reading of the book is different.
Well, my take on this is that I don't know how to produce non-situated knowledge. And I think it's important to sort of make it explicit to say, well, what perspective you are talking from. Of course, we need to have a methodology, and we have to look at sources, and we have to sort of ground our work, but I don't think we can really produce an objective knowledge in the sense of that we would not have a sort of personal opinion visible into it, or having a take on it. But I think that the knowledge is more powerful if you also sort of contain your personal opinion and the way you present the material, making it explicit, but sort of not replacing the research. So I think it's a very difficult balance, but it must be preserved. Also, there is all these discussions about public history and the public role of the historians, and how much we should participate openly in public discussion. And I think it also depends on different personalities and our different professional itineraries, and it's sort of seen widely differently in different academic contexts. I was trained in France, and I have seen several times American professors presenting research in French universities in a very engaged way, and I saw really a clash of academic culture in this sense. But maybe it's starting to change. I don't know. Maybe now there is a clash against situated knowledge.
Following the discussion, I would like you to summarize your chapter on this Routledge handbook on energy democracy, in which you discuss the title is Energy Democracy, Nuclear Power and Participatory Knowledge in the production of radiation risk. Perhaps it's connected with that discussion. And I couldn't read the book, I would like you also to say something about how was this project on energy democracy for making this collective book.
So it's a chapter that I wrote with my colleague Olga Kuczynska, who's also Belarusian, and she wrote what I consider for me the best book on the Chernobyl accident consequences and the public visibility of the Chernobyl health effects and what to depend on. Because for me, I was sort of dealing with memory and the history of Chernobyl disaster, but the book sort of made me understand the stakes in production of knowledge and why it's so hard to produce knowledge on radiation health effects. And it's basically, treats of this things, but in more sort of contemporary sociological perspective on the production of knowledge and communication. And I'd say in this chapter, the conceptual part is a lot, common to the book Olga's produced, and we were sort of discussing our common field experience in Chernobyl disasters, and especially my experience with international projects that were led by French experts on the contaminated territories, and that's how sort of we came to collaborate together on this. And it's sort of accidental how it often happens. There was this Olga's colleagues in environmental communication with producing this handbook on energy democracy, and they asked us to do something on this subject and nuclear energy, and we of course wanted to deal with Chernobyl, basically to show that nuclear energy doesn't really fit the definition of energy democracy, because one cannot democratically produce the knowledge that can help us to evaluate the risks that are caused by this nuclear technology. And because this is not possible, that means that there is not possible democratic nuclear energy, because we cannot really all the knowledge about these risks is expert-centered, is top-down, and there is not really meaningful participation, at least in the cases that we studied in Chernobyl context, non-meaningful participation of the public in the production of this knowledge about risks.
I have two questions, but the first is more a reflection. No, many people say that capitalism includes different crises as part of it, and then you mentioned that in the 70s and 80s is when the debate became public, and then different environmental groups and people in the street claiming against the waste nuclear problem. And then this time was also the time of the oil crisis and the petroleum and gas crisis, and the price of energy rise a lot. And nowadays happens the same, no? We have another energy price crisis, but however, in contrast to the emergence of a public movement concern on nuclear energy, the European Union has approved, as you mentioned, that nuclear energy is green. So my question would be not just why in the 70s and 80s these new movements appear, but how can we understand that in two moments with price energy problems, the answer and the public answer was so different, at least from an external point of view?
I would say, because I don't have an answer, I would answer in this way that, I mean, we'll still have to see what happens with this energy crisis. I would think it's still very recent, and especially with regard to the nuclear energy. I mean, we have a war in the country where was 15 operating nuclear reactors and extensive other nuclear infrastructure. So it's really unprecedented event, and I would say, you know, wait a bit to see, you know, how can we describe this period. Not that I'm optimistic, but I would say it's still early. It's early to say. But it's also true that since the 70s, nuclear industry, the capitalism in general, if you prefer, also sort of learn how to, you know, co-opt and contain public criticism, and this rather well-controlled public participation and citing for deep geological repository for me is a really good example of how one sort of contain this public discontent and disarm it in a way. So maybe that's also plays a role.
Yes. Yes, no, I was thinking just if comparing the two periods, no, I was thinking if we also can reflect about that loss of idealism in society in the 70s and 80s was also the time of, or after May 78, while nowadays not, but it was just a reflection. I'm not sure as you say.
Adding another like social and cultural history dimension to it. I wouldn't dare, at least not tonight.
Yes. José Ramón?
We have some questions from people online from the chat, but maybe you can mention. This is a question from Jaume Sastre.
Yes, I can read it if you want for you. It's from Jaume Sastre. Thank you for this great talk, Tatiana, and hello from Paris. Many times the question how we manage waste and the emphasis of management of waste is a good way to not deal with the question of how do we stop producing waste. This is the approach of the nuclear industry with the cleanup of past decades, and the plastic industry with recycling, for example. Ways of not dealing with the roots of the problem, nuclear weapons and power plants on the one hand, and capitalism, consumerism on the other. But at the same time, those who radically oppose both nuclear energy and massive use of plastic should be interested in waste management, because in both cases, the negative effects of waste do not disappear when the activity stops. The question is, have you found anti-nuclear experts in waste management or anti-nuclear reflections about waste management? Gracias.
What is that?
Anti-nuclear experts in waste management or anti-nuclear reflections about waste management.
What do you found? What does it mean found?
In your research. Hello, espera. Can you hear me or not?
Yes.
Sí, Jaume.
Espera.
Perfectamente.
Go ahead.
This was to force you.
Hello. No, if all the reflections cases you are studying about waste management come from the state, nuclear industry, etc., or have you, I mean, what is the position of these experts on waste management? Have you found different ways of approaching the problem according to the positions of the people who are working with it, or in academia, or how are anti-nuclear people or more critical voices approaching waste management? If there's something, it was just
yeah, of course, very different ways even to call this waste, and I sort of call it radioactive waste, which is like very narrow nuclear industry managerial perspective, because I decided to sort of focus on this, not to go into other aspects. But of course, you know, for example, there is this World Nuclear Waste Report written by the experts, which I would say a bit more on the anti-nuclear position, but with you know, intimate knowledge of the industry radioactive waste management. And they say we deliberately use the term nuclear to refer to the nuclear technology and nuclear energy, because you know, there is this distinction between nuclear is something positive and radioactive is like waste, as if waste is not part of nuclear technology. Of course, there are very different perspectives, and including this view of that we have to sort of stop producing the waste, and not only discussing its management, was sometimes as a distraction. But I still don't know how to sort of render this diversity of positions in a meaningful way in my research. Right now, I'm sort of a bit trying not to get drowned in the sea of radioactive waste, and you know, trying not to like take too many categories of industry management into my vocabulary for granted. And for instance, you know, considering military and civilian waste as part of the same thing, and this is already extremely challenging. So you're absolutely right, and one needs to be very attentive to that. But render it in a meaningful way in research and writing is still a challenge.
Muchas gracias, súper interesante.
And for instance, before the war started, I did have a project on the non-nuclear waste, and especially in the plastic waste in Russia, and the history of waste. And then with the war, I understood I won't be able to go to Russia for a while, maybe several decades, and I don't want to go there, so I had to abandon it. But it was enough for me to understand how challenging it can be just to sort of try to study plastic waste with the same approaches I studied nuclear waste, and sort of trying to connect it in my work. I definitely didn't see any way to do it. It's just everything seems just so different from the first side. One really needs to get into the essence of the things to maybe to find much more connections and common logics, but it's not easy.
I think Josep Simon also has a question.
Yes, I have a very specific question, which is about what you mentioned on the military and civilian relationships. I am curious to know how this relationship is handled in your sources. If it is hidden, I don't know if your main sources are governmental reports or what type of sources. If this relationship is hidden, or it is shown without any problem, any ethical problem, or how it is presented, appears in this type of sources. And the more general questions are about that. I mean, I expected from you gave us an impressive big picture, very useful, and perhaps because of this, I didn't see things that I expected in the abstract and the title of the talk. For instance, knowing more about the controversy itself, maybe in a classic way. I mean, how we define a controversy in a sociological or philosophical way. It is structured in certain steps or dynamics. There are certain actors that intervene. There are certain results, maybe consensus or not, etc. I don't know if you could say something about that. And the other thing is related to the sources. As you presented this great and so rich overview, the sources are not visible, and I don't know if you're using mainly governmental reports by international organizations like the International Atomic Agency, or if you're using other type of sources, and also in terms of geopolitics, are these the main sources you use related to the US, France, Germany, Great Britain, or are you dealing with sources in other countries? Because at the end of the picture, we know that there is much more literature probably in these places about these subjects, but they have been produced also in a context of Cold War or post-Cold War, and I wonder if it is possible in primary and secondary sources to have a different picture if you look at, for instance, things produced in other countries more towards the east and so.
So, and this is a first attempt for me to sort of exit in a meaningful way post-Soviet countries and also sort of get a global picture, because I really was always much more comfortable with like very concrete cases in the region I know. So this talk is based partially on all the research I have done on the former Soviet countries, and here both primary sources and interview. Although I mean in the overview I didn't go in great scope of detail, so you can see meaningful views of the sources. But I also used work of my colleagues I worked with in international projects, and that's why basically I think there is a sort of certain countries that appear more. It's just because I know national stories better and some sources, and I sort of know better that what I'm talking for. And if I wanted to really include all the countries, for example, you would notice that Great Britain is not that much present in my talk, because I didn't work closely with the colleagues or follow the cases that much. For the use of controversies in the classic case, one really need to sort of have a very narrow case study, so you really can sort of look at the mechanics and actors. So it either has to be very not very, but somewhat narrow topic, like debate about waste disposal in the oceans in 56, as I think Havlin book, or it has to be based on some like concrete case. I don't know how to do controversy studies, like sort of on great geographical and historical scope. And at least for me right now, I just sort of getting on the macro level to better choose my cases on the sort of intermediate level and better focus on certain on the sources. From the point of view of sources, there is of course a great excitement for me to stop working on former Soviet countries, where you're really it's difficult to get sources, and basically when you try to even build a timeline on the history of something, you would have all these wise spots that you try to avoid and show in new articles, but it's very difficult. Whereas when you study, for example, US case and even in international case, you have all this, in government reports and a lot of, historical archives, which are not only available, but they also available online, and they also sort of already researched, so you need where to find something. So this is a great relief. Of course, for decades of working on, for Soviet nuclear industry, I have better understanding, but of certain things and where to find sources. And I have, thousands of photocopies that I brought from my trips to Russia, and I, go through hoping to find missing pieces, but sometimes it's really very rare. I mean, it's really hard work to find like little piece of information when one institution was created and who was behind it. It seems to be primitive when you sort of relate it an article, but it's so hard to get sometimes. And from the point of view how this military civilian aspects of nuclear energy is related into the sources. In the sources, once there is this sort of institutional the divide between civilian and military nuclear energy started to be institutionalized. Of course, you would read the report and they reproduce this divide. So it's sometimes hard to sort of put things together to see the connection. But in some cases, it's pretty obvious, and I don't think about a concrete document, but I think about rather recent discourse by Macron, who was talking, I think, about this plans to renew French nuclear arsenals, the submarines and the ships, and replace them by new devices. And he was saying, but of course, I mean, civilian nuclear applications, military nuclear applications cannot be considered separately, so they go hand in hand, and we really have to think of the national program of development of these technologies together. But in other cases, it's much more divided, and I would wait in some context and comment on my talk, saying that she doesn't understand anything. She confuses this nuclear weapons test with nuclear reactors producing energy. This is completely different things, and they will be right from certain points of view, but not from me as a researcher and historian point of view. But what is I think is changing is that there is more and more expertise available in this area, produced by different networks concerned with nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. For instance, I was reading a report produced by the ICANN organization, so it's International Network Against Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and there was a report on the military radioactive waste in France. And it's basically, there was since the 90s, there was only one parliamentary report on this subject, which is pretty complete in 97. And now this report was of, it's a rare document where you really have a summarizing of all the problems and all the waste, which is treated as waste, and you don't have to sort of read between the lines and the official reports. I mean, what is waste, what is not? Do they have uranium mine waste, or they do not manage it? And usually it's very hard to find this information, even if you look at the IAEA documentation. For example, the safety recommendations on the classification of radioactive waste, there's barely like 3 lines on uranium mining and weapons test and accidents as waste. So you think, is it really not radioactive waste? Is it radioactive waste? I mean, am I imagining things? And so this is pretty complex. But the expertise and the analysis produced by more and more by international and governmental organizations and networks is really valuable in this regard. And I would think it's it's maybe not a new phenomenon, but I really see more and more publications that are extremely useful in this regard.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have learned a lot about a topic with which I'm not very familiarized about. And I have found very interesting this idea that the definition of the threshold and what was waste or not wasn't just a scientific debate or a discussion, it was also a political one. And I think that this brings us to a field that somehow was missed in your presentation, which is the field of international relations. And I mean, how did the international power hierarchies affect these controversies, discussions on thresholds, on definitions? How did international negotiations influence these debates? I don't know if you have done some research about it, or if you consider to extend your research to this topic.
Yeah, this is something that I mentioned as a concluding remark, and there is some reading, at least, if not research, to be done. My colleague in the project now is trying to write an overview of the history of how the human exposure to radioactivity was treated, and he having a lot of it's very difficult, so I wait for him to finish it and then I jump into it. But there is definitely some material, food for thought in this book. And for instance, on the topic of thresholds and exposure norms, there is a simple fact that US and Great Britain sort of controlled or could influence the first international groups of experts that sort of were to establish this first norms and thresholds in terms of public exposure to radioactivity. And I'm talking, for instance, about the United Nations Scientific Committee for the Effects of Atomic Radiation. I don't know, UNSCARE, I don't know if this abbreviation is pronounced. And then another international organization, which names escapes me right now, which was basically this, so to speak, independent international committee for radiation protection, which was this international independent committee, supposedly independent, that was to produce this independent recommendations, and still is a powerful organization, produce international recommendations for radiation protection, and there is we can see concrete connections of the networks of individuals and captations of and circulations of the same experts between different organizations and government offices. So, I mean, of course, the international relations and international order and the hierarchy of powers really influenced a great deal this radiation protection norms and threshold. But I know where to read, but I still don't know how to, include it in my research in a nice way without it going into completely another direction, and without it, sort of being treated along the line of conspiracy theory or other simplistic way.
I have another question on the maps, because on the one hand, you saw the map with the testing the nuclear bombs in very far places, the Marshall Islands, the French Polynesia, etc. But on the other hand, you saw the nuclear was dumped in the ocean. A map showing how the nuclear was dumped, and it surprised me that it was very close to the countries, to the coast. So my question is, I was thinking about why in that case. Perhaps because they want to avoid conflicts with the countries, with the neighboring countries, or perhaps because they dismiss the toxicity of waste, because on the one hand they bomb some areas, but the waste was very close to their capitals and to their coast.
I don't know the answer, and I can make an educated guess that there are possibly different reasons for it, including, you know, how doable it is to dispose of waste, how far can you go, and how much it costs, and whether it's. But I'm also I would say that the scientists also underestimated in a very important way the toxicity of this material, and they didn't really know the way how they circulate in the environment. For instance, in the early years, for example, they didn't realize that the radioactive toxins can accumulate in certain organisms. So that they just thought they would sort of be dispersed in the environment, and you know, there was all this, especially for the river, but I suspect something similar could be said about the oceans as well. But in the river, there was all this studies of fish, for example, in Columbia River, where Hanford site put its waste, and there was really surprising. They found that the radioactivity accumulated in the salmon very, very far downstream, and in a very significant way. So I think that there was also lack of knowledge and a bit of optimistic vision of how it will, how efficiently it will sort of contain and the waste, and also disperse any leaks that would come out of the containers.
Yes, José Ramón.
No, just very quickly, you think about the tension between the volume of the waste matter and the intensity of radioactivity, where you say that low and intermediate radioactive matter is not taken care of or is less present in public debates. From a naive point of view, one would think that volume might be important, maybe not for governments that might focus on decisions on the most radioactive matter, but for the public opinion in general, not that the public is ignorant, of course, no? But volume is volume. It takes space. If you need to create a facility, it takes more space. I don't know why you say, or why it happens that it's out of the radar decisions and discussions.
But the fact that it's, I mean, I think it's waste, but for it to be sort of visible as waste in the environment, it also takes work to make it visible. So, for example, you know, the waste in the Chernobyl radioactive zone is very little visible, right? And there are all these reports about wild nature coming back and thriving in the absence of the human, which sort of hides the issue of waste even more. But for instance, for uranium mines, I can say that there have been much more vocal protests about these issues of abandoned mines, and it's at least in the US context, this is the issue that is taken care of. But I don't think like the sheer amount or volume by itself can contribute. It may contribute, but it's definitely not enough to, especially if it's spread on vast territories, and you think just of 1 mile mine which is situated in your territory, you don't maybe make this easy connection between thousands of other mines. You know, you need maybe some social movement and some experts to sort of connect all this in one map and present it as some kind of problem.
Yeah. Two questions related with the problem of raising public attention, attracting public attention to the debate in the terms you discuss the problem of radioactivity. Well, this morning we have a long talk from the right-wing party, from the president of the right-wing party in Spain.
On that?
Was a talk from the president of the right-wing party here in Spain, asking for more nuclear plants in Spain. So we have all the discussion of in France concerning radioactivity or nuclear energy as a green energy. All discussions all over Europe. Also.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I would like to ask you if you think that in these public controversies we have on this issue, we can detect this kind of merchant of doubt, which was common in the debates of climate change or the dangers of tobacco or in many of the toxic products. I'm thinking in one person in France with this collapsist. He's an engineer who is a collapsist. The name is Jean-Marc Jancovici, and he has been during the last weeks in public television saying that well, there is not very much danger concerning radioactivity than I guess the discussion was it was more dangerous being close to a nuclear plant than eating processed food, I think. But that was in the television. It's a public figure, and he participated in many debates with ideas connected to collapses. So he's discussing in very much in terms of the crisis of energy and the oil, the big oil, and so on. But he's supporting nuclear energy in France. So I don't know if you can find this kind of people in other countries, perhaps with the support of the nuclear industry. So I don't know.
Well, I haven't studied his personal itinerary, and I have been asked a lot to watch his presentations or to read him, because he was a very famous public figure and very popular among young people in France for quite a while. But I wouldn't call him merchant of doubt in terms of, I think he sincerely believed, like many other climate activists and from young generation, that nuclear energy can really be helpful and is a lesser evil. I think, we really need historical perspective, and what these people miss is the history. And I really think because they don't know history, they sort of accept this nuclear industry discourse and promises about the future sort of without much criticism. And the history also sort of shows this connection with the military, which is completely ignored in the climate change debate. But this kind of people they're present in many countries, and famous green activists that went on to the dark side and started to defend nuclear. I think it happens fairly often.
Here, probably similar figure is Antonio Turiel, who is against nuclear energy. Has similar point of view concerning collapses, but is against nuclear energy. But okay, my other question is about an activity we had many years ago here. We have we project films here in this room, and one of the films we have was Into Eternity. It's a film on the Finnish on the Finnish waste radioactivity facility, and we tried also, but we couldn't, to have the film by Peter Gallison
containment. Yeah.
So what do you think about this film and the capacity of these films to raise public attention and to introduce new elements in the public debate?
Well, into eternity, it's been a long time, so I don't really, I wouldn't speak about this film, but Gallison's film I watched a couple of times, and one time was participation of him himself, and I found it's quite. No, I really started to believe in recent years in the power of art. To bring into attention some subjects connected to nuclear energy or disasters or waste. And it happens to me, especially was related to the Chernobyl series, because I have been studied Chernobyl memory, like for decades, and I never, ever seen Chernobyl disaster so much debated as after this series, including in the post-Soviet spaces. So I think sometimes, and just to make, something a topic of public discussions, public visibility, art can be more efficient than the science. So I think we as scientists, if we have this arty feeling, we should sort of try to also engage in some collaborations. And Gallison did it in I think in a very nice way. They were complaining that it's sort of from commercial point of view, it's of course a disaster, but as a sort of product, for the future of memory for radioactive waste, he talks about in his film. I think it's a beautiful thing.
Probably you said something about it during your presentation, and I didn't get it. And I'm aware that this is a big question for this time of the afternoon, but I would really appreciate if you could say something about the role of private corporations in this story.
Yeah. I sort of was asking myself a question whether sort of corporate production of ignorance and containment and captation of public protest would be really, or management of some hot issues as accidents or waste is very different from the sort of state military a way of doing it, and I don't. So far, and I do it, of course, more through discussions with colleagues than from my own research. So far, from the discussion with colleagues, it does seem to be really pretty similar. So there are more common things there than distant things. Yeah, that's. If not that usually private corporations are a bit better in public relations and production of sort of they're more sort of sophisticated and more subtle, but it's maybe because I'm thinking of the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia and its way of doing public relations, which is pretty unsophisticated.
Okay, I think there is no more questions in the chat, and I don't know if there are more questions in the room. But in any case, also we are very close to the ending time. Yeah, it was an intense seminar with a lot of questions, with many interesting topics. So all of us thank you very much, Tatiana, for your seminar. And I think it's an excellent way to start the seminar series of the López Piñero Institute, as well as the History of Science Society of Catalonia. So many thanks, and see you next month with another seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and wonderful questions. And it's really great for each researcher to be able to present this work in progress and benefit from the collective intelligence. Thank you so much.